I'd like to welcome, you'll see pop up on your screens now, my two colleagues who will be joining me. We've got Lyall Cresswell, founder and CEO at Transport Exchange Group. We've got Kirsten Tisdale, supply chain expert, both on the panel with us today. I'm now going to ask each of them just to introduce themselves and give a couple of lines. Starting off with you, Lyall. Good afternoon.
Hi, Sam, and thanks for the intro. It's great to be here and hold this webinar about data and TG price index for the very first time. Just to introduce myself, I'm Lyall Cresswell. I founded Transport Exchange Group 21 years ago. So we've been at this and we've been witnessing the evolution of digitalization for quite a long time now at first hand. And we're very much immersed in the transport and logistics industry. Just a little bit of background also about Transport Exchange Group for those of you that aren't acquainted with what we do. We are the leading freight exchange in the UK. As I said, we've been established for 21 years. Alongside the digital marketplace, the freight exchange as we call it, we also provide all of the tools and integrations which our users require in order to make collaboration and efficient working between thousands of trading partners as successful as possible. Today's talk's actually focused around something that we introduced literally 3 months ago, and many of you will be familiar with, and that is the price index, which we started publishing. That we believe is a first in the UK industry, giving a real insight into the dynamic marketplace that we see today in the road transport industry. And we'll be talking more about that over the course of the next half hour or so.
Excellent. And Lyall, would you mind sharing with those of us who are on the call who aren't so familiar some of the key numbers that are behind the data that we're going to be talking about today?
Yeah, sure. So looking last year, 2021, obviously it's growing all the time, but at the end of last year, we had around 8,400 member businesses. They range in size from household names, larger logistics service providers, 3PLs, freight forwarders, large transportation companies, both on the courier side and on the haulage side, right the way through to smaller independent companies and many owner drivers as well. That number is growing all the time. All of those businesses, I would stress, join our platform as accredited operators on the platform. So this is very much a network which is there for the long term for those businesses. Last year, 2021, we had approximately 2.1 million confirmed bookings. So those are transactions which were completed fully in the platform. And that was approximately 55% increase on the previous year. And we expect to see those growth trends continuing this year in 2022 as well.
Excellent. Thanks, Lyall. I think that's a real key point about the number of participant businesses that we've got on the platform, because actually we're seeing here the result of thousands of different combinations of sort of parties buying and selling transport capacity on the platform. So it's a really unique piece about this data and something that we should really bear in mind in terms of the breadth and depth of the data that we've got available. So fantastic. Thank you, Lyall. I'm delighted now to introduce Kirsten Tisdale, logistics and supply chain expert. Kirsten, good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Sam. I'm always interested in anything that involves analysis or modelling. I'm a consultant and my whole career's been in logistics and supply chain, and I have a maths degree. And I really love it when those things are able to come together. I've been intrigued by the Transport Exchange Group Index since it started being published at the start of November last year. It gives a real-time window into what's happening in road transport. So thank you.
Excellent.
I think it's also worth mentioning just before we start that transport and logistics is a leading indicator, and we can see this afternoon with the announcement that the interest rates have gone up for the first time, how closely aligned or otherwise that is with the rest of the economy as well.
Absolutely, absolutely. So just to give a little bit of flavour around some of before we dive into the discussions today, and a bit more of the numbers behind the index. So 2021 is certainly a year when logistics made the headlines. And here I'm going to pull up just the headline road transport price index number that you may have seen on our social channels or even in the press that was picked up this year. Now, because of the way that our data works, we can actually separate the headline number into component parts to give a bit more granular understanding of exactly what's going on in the market. So if now start to look at courier versus haulage. Now, for us, haulage is anything that requires an operator's license. That's 7.5 tons above in the UK, and courier obviously being below that on typically the van and the courier work. So we've got the yellow line versus the blue line here. And what's really fascinating is throughout 2021, the actual lines swap places in terms of the inflation that we saw in the market. Now, if we look at actually some of the key points of inflection along that trend last year and what was happening in the headlines, we start to understand exactly what might have been behind it. So at the start of last year, I don't think any of us will forget the announcement when Boris came onto our television and told us that we must stay at home. It was quite a remarkable announcement. I remember being in my home and thinking, wow, I better start running now and getting my 5Ks in every day for my daily exercise and walking down the shops and trying to buy toilet rolls. It was quite a remarkable time. And that really tallies in with January when the lockdown was announced, and also the subsequent dip into February as the vast sections of the economy were shut down or paused. Lots of colleagues went on to furlough, etc. But we did see a pick back up, and that was really punctuated in April of 2021 when the non-essential businesses reopened. We were all able to go back into London, Soho. The streets were lined here with people drinking and eating. We were able to get a haircut again, thankfully for that. And that really kind of coincided then as the blue line of haulage started to ramp up. And we see that actually overtake the courier line in April of last year. Now, this was a thing that continued into the back end of 2021. And we saw more headlines again as things like the fuel shortage started to kick in. We will all be absolutely familiar on the call today of all of the driver shortages, but actually the fuel shortages as people queuing up on the fuel courts, as we were told that there was a supply chain issue that meant that it couldn't be delivered from the hubs to the forecourts. This really coincided with the peak of the haulage spike last year in the tail end of September 2021. So really clear to see some milestones in the headlines aligning with some of the patterns and the trends that we see within the Road Transport Price Index. So let's turn to our panel now and start to talk about some of the things in a little bit more detail. I'd like to start off with you, Lyall. We've talked about the price per mile and the increase that we've seen throughout 2021. And how much of this do you think, Lyall, is attributable to things like shift in demand? And what do you see are the long-term trends that we should be aware of as we move into 2022?
That's a great question. I'd like to actually talk as much about transport and logistics as about the way that on-demand and the on-demand economy, as we call it, is increasingly driving behaviour. First, we can see that from consumer behaviour, and then business behaviour obviously follows suit. COVID's accelerated that. Everybody recognises that. Over the last couple of years, it's changed behaviour. But even before that, there was already a change in consumer behaviour driven by the increasing, what we call, and it's rather an ungainly word, but the increasing platformization of large chunks of the economy. I'm thinking particularly, if you think back to the first evidence of that, would be ride-hailing apps such as Uber. Then, of course, we became quite familiar and started to use food delivery apps, which are now very, very well embedded in the consumer behavior and psychology. And of course, then there's further iterations of that, the latest and greatest one of those being rapid grocery delivery, where we see huge amounts of investment going into ultra-fast, hyper-local deliveries of groceries. And what's happening here is reflected, of course, in transportation and logistics, because the delivery component, part of that, whether it's moving people, as in the case of Uber, or whether it's in the case of moving goods, with whether they're finished goods or fresh in terms of food and meals, they're just symptomatic of the general upscaling of the on-demand economy, which has been growing and growing over the past few years and now is reaching new heights. Some of those things, and we'll come on to talk about that a little later on, are not particularly sustainable, I don't think, both commercially, but also from an environmental point of view in terms of the logistics. But they do represent a fundamental shift in demand. And we're now starting to see that also impacting on the movement of freight. So I'm sure Kirsten will talk to this as well, but if you think about the introduction many decades ago of just-in-time with manufacturing, that did very noticeably lead to far more deliveries, but obviously quite clearly smaller delivery sizes quite often. And that was a movement which obviously was just in time, led to lower inventory, and that's been a feature for many years. But what I think we're now starting to see is, again, driven by the consumer behavior, is the absolute expectation of everything being available on demand. And I think that impacts on our market in transport and logistics. And certainly the data is starting to show that.
Fantastic. I think really interesting to hear that whilst we've seen a huge amount of inflation, it might not all be down to those headlines that we saw. There may be some actual underlying shifts in the market and how the consumption comes around, and the demand that means it might be more long term. That's fascinating. Eric, Kirsten, you've been looking at some of the other data, from other sources. What trends have you spotted?
Well, I mean, 2021 has been such a changeable year in terms of supply chain environment, and it will go down as the year of both shortages and price rises, fuel, drivers, vehicles, all of them. The costs have been responding to changes in demand, in general inflation, in capacity, in part down to the driver shortage. The general rise in haulage rates is not been as extreme as the spot rate that we're seeing in the TEG index. The official measure for freight by road that comes from the Office for National Statistics, for the whole year it looked quite conservative, but if you looked at it quarter by quarter, it rose very fast in the last couple of quarters, in the last half year. Perhaps those cost prices that we've seen took longer to filter through to contractual work. Motor transport's cost tables, which people looked to, showed an overall 10% increase in pence per mile for Arctics over the whole year. I mean, logistics is good at getting the job done, whatever's required of it. But as Lyall indicated, on demand is inflationary. It's inherently less efficient. And when you're seeing increases in all of the different elements, that's all compounding to produce that inflation that we've seen.
And also what I'd say, Sam, is even if we just consider work from home, which of course is we're now in this kind of uncertain territory where we're not quite sure what the future looks like. Certain businesses are planting their flag very firmly in the "you will be in the office" territory. Others are saying, you can carry on working from home forever, effectively. But the net result of that, of course, is a huge spike in delivery points by all manner of services and also product. And that has to be fulfilled from somewhere. And going back to what Kirsten said, you can introduce certain efficiencies from a logistics point of view into that new pattern. But when you throw in on demand, which effectively says, I expect something within 15 minutes, going back to the example of the rapid grocery delivery, which seems to be very much the topic of the day, clearly it's very difficult to both fulfill that consumer expectation and also be efficient at the same time. And something's got to give.
Absolutely. It's fascinating, the work from home trend. I was at an event with TfL somewhat recently, and they were talking about the shift of work from home and how that meant for delivery companies who were delivering parcels, who before would be able to park their vehicle up and walk from office building to office building, suddenly having to go into much more urban type locations and having to drive much further between stops. And often people were out in the garden or walking the dog or asleep or on a Zoom call or a meeting like this, and suddenly then the effectiveness and the success rate of those deliveries go down as well massively. And then I've got to drive another 5 or 10 miles tomorrow to try and deliver this parcel rather than leaving it with reception. So I think there's a huge amount of kind of change, and quite what that impact will be fascinating as it continues, no doubt, in this new hybrid world, or whatever it may turn out to be.
And
Fab. Okay, please, Kirsten.
Sorry, you saw that that change to home deliveries at the beginning of the pandemic really clearly in the TEG index. When you look at the separate Haulage and Courier, you see a complete split between the two before they then came back together again for much of 2020 and the early bit of 2021.
Yeah.
Excellent. So that leads us quite nicely actually onto some trends that we've seen in the data, and one of the things that we really sort of came into force last year were the emissions initiatives, so sort of around sustainability, around air quality, and we saw last year a number of new clean air zones come on stream. So I'm going to read from my list here, but last year we saw Bath, Birmingham, Portsmouth. We've got Oxford with a 0 emission zone going live at the end of February. And of course, the London ULEZ expanded significantly last year, and then the impact of that now much bigger than the original zone. So as we see these schemes roll out across the country, Lyall, what do you think are the things we need to think of for those people who are on the call?
Well, they're fascinating, aren't they? I've got first-hand experience living in London of the ULEZ, which has effectively put a ring around North and South London. It's a very big area. As you mentioned, there's clean air zones in many other cities, and I expect most large urban areas will eventually have them. So what we're really anticipating and looking forward to in terms of the index is seeing what the impact of these CAZs and the ULEZ is on freight movements into those areas. Will it cause a spike in price? I think that's probably inevitable in the short term, so we should be able to see that quite soon. We've already seen on Transport Exchange Group the rise of operators, couriers and hauliers offering sustainable freight transport. So whether that's cargo bikes, or also there seem to be quite a number of specialist manufacturers producing EVs, both small EVs and also some of the mainstream vehicles which we're already familiar with are offering hybrid and EV options as well. And I think that's inevitable, that's going to carry on increasing. The interesting thing from the data for price to see whether that's causing a spike in it is also to see to what extent the clean air zones foster collaboration between operators. So I've always been a firm believer that the economic imperative drives changes in behavior. And will we see those actually fostering collaboration? So instead of 4 vehicles going into a CAZ or into an urban area, will we see operators actually collaborating and getting together and driving one EV? Or will we also see, and I think the answer to this is yes, the rise of specialist urban logistics operators. That's certainly something, a trend that we've noticed over the past 12 to 18 months. And just before I finish on that point, the interesting thing is that the councils can see clearly through a number plate recognition, and because obviously they want to tax vehicles and penalise those that don't meet the standards. So they can see the vehicles that are going in and out of these zones, but what they can't see is 2 very fundamental aspects, and this is again where the data can become very useful. So they can't see what the effective utilisation of those vehicles is. There's absolutely no way they've got of knowing whether that vehicle that crosses that line, that virtual line, the geofence, is full, empty, half full, where, whatever. And also they don't know where it's come from. Is that simply a local delivery that's crossing the boundary, or has it come 100 miles, or has it come from another country? They have virtually no way of saying that. I mean, that's what the data is going to show us, and it's going to show us how the behavior is changing. There's another point as well in this whole sustainability piece. So we've got the clean air zones and the ULEZ are very much facts. They're there on the ground now. But there's a huge elephant in the room, which people are just starting to get their heads around, which is what's the government going to do as fuel duty, which is a significant contributor towards the exchequer, begins to reduce meaningfully as more and more EVs hit the road? It's an unresolved question. Personally, I think that we'll end up with road user charging. And again, if you think about it, at this moment in time, you pay your license fee. Doesn't matter whether you drive a mile a year or 100,000 miles a year in that vehicle, you pay a fat fee. But there is a cost to it. At the moment, those external costs aren't particularly recognised because, as I say, you know, the road maintenance and everything else comes out of that pot, out of the general taxation pot, as well as coming out of the license fee. Something's going to have to replace that. And again, from a sustainability point of view and a change in behaviour, which is effectively what we're talking about here, it's going to undoubtedly foster collaboration amongst operators as they recognise that they've got to do things differently. And consumers and shippers are also going to have to change their behaviour as well. So there's quite a few different aspects, I think, to the sustainability. And I think the data that we're seeing both in the TG index and also from other areas will help to support that and stay ahead of where those changes are.
I see the clean air zones as being really important. As a past asthma sufferer, I'm extremely supportive of them. But I have to say, from an industry point of view, it is hugely expensive if you don't have a Euro 6 compliant vehicle. The Bath Clean Air Zone is £100 for 24 hours, which is a significant increase in daily costs. So I was really interested to see, in a snapshot of data that Sam allowed me to have a look at, that Transport Exchange is seeing a fourfold increase in requests for delivery by hauliers into Bath, which is way above the 55% increase that you're seeing in your year-on-year bookings. And that will be from companies that don't want to visit Bath themselves. And hopefully an element of that is collaboration. So one haulier who is visiting Bath in a Euro 6 compliant vehicle is taking other people's goods with them.
But interestingly enough, that's going to have to also result in a change in behaviour with the shipper as well, and the distributor, because they've got to realise that this sustainability, which is fostered by and driven by these zones, is going to change the way that distribution occurs.
Another element that I don't see really discussed elsewhere is the payload of electric vehicles, of EVs.
That's true, yeah.
And whether that's going to actually drive there needing to be more vehicles on the road, because if their payload is less, do we then need more vehicles and more drivers, further exacerbating the driver shortage?
Fascinating discussion. I think clearly with the number of clean air zones launching, I think it's certainly going in a particular direction. So fascinating to hear some of the thoughts, and we'll be looking at some of the data on our side that we'll clearly be sharing on the usual channels around the impact of these clean air zones and what they mean for the logistics market. Just a quick call for questions, actually. I see we've got a fantastic number of attendees on the line, which is awesome, but please don't be shy. Your questions go straight to our adjudicators behind the scenes. So anything that you ask, we can share your name or not if you choose not to, but I'm very happy to take any questions that you may have. Fantastic. And I think just thinking about all of these changes that we've talked about the headlines of logistics over the last year, 2021. We've talked about the clean air zones, lots and lots of things happening. So I guess in the state of flux that many of the people on the call find themselves and the industry, when we think about data, clearly there's an opportunity there, and how we can leverage it. And those of us who are on the call to leverage it to create growth and opportunity. So, Kirsten, for those of us who are on the call now and are looking to drive outcomes for their business on the back of data, whether it's the TG Road Transport Index, some of the other reports that we've got available, or indeed other sources of data, where should they start?
I think the most important place to start is to actually be using any data that you're holding in your organisation. Until you start using it, you won't understand the quality, you won't understand what it can tell you, you won't see what's missing, and mix it up. Don't just be analysing your telematics data, mix that up with your financial data and with your people data and with external data like the TEG index. And also there's all sorts of now much more real time, like the TEG index, sort of info that's coming out of even people like the Office for National Statistics, who historically had quite old data. You know, there was always a time lag before it was available, but they have things now like the traffic index, which shows how hot logistics was running for the whole of last year. And if you're interested in retail logistics, as I am, the CBI's distributive trade survey is interesting, with retail stock being seen as being too low again for about the 9th month running. So there's lots of stuff out there. Look for it, access it, mix it up with your own data, and see what comes out.
Excellent. I think the message is get stuck in, roll the sleeves up. Fantastic. Couldn't agree more. Lyall, what's the view from your side?
Yeah, I mean, if I take our own viewpoint of the world, so at TEG, Transport Exchange Group, we are very immersed in data. We use a lot of data to make sure that we run the platform as effectively, as efficiently as possible. Going back to what Kirsten was just referring to, so there's a wealth of data out there, and I think a lot of people get, you know, overwhelmed by it. It's very easy to get overwhelmed by it, and then you end up with, you know, paralysis because you just have too much. So what we're trying to do with the index is give the businesses on our platform and the wider industry as a whole something that's very, very easy to consume. So interestingly enough, for those of you that know the transport and logistics industry, it's a very fragmented, very, very fragmented industry. I think the average size of the fleet historically was, Kirsten, you might correct me what it is now, but historically it was always around in the UK 5 vehicles. And those thousands and tens of thousands of businesses find it very, very difficult to understand how to benchmark with other companies, and then how to analyze and monitor, and then also predict maybe what they should be doing, what they should be charging, what vehicles maybe they should be adding to their fleet, especially in a time of change, because we're going through this, you know, industrial revolution, however you want to call it now, and it's compressed into a very tight timescale. So the idea with the TEG index in particular is to give businesses a very easy to understand, real-time or near real-time view of the world that they can benchmark and understand what is my place. And what we've seen over the last, and you can see this from the index, over the past couple of years especially, is the volatility in this market. When things, Sam, are relatively static, I actually thinking about this when we talk about the container market, for example, not road transport, but very consequential, obviously for importers and exporters here in the UK, especially. For many, many years, that was a fairly stable market. Yes, it would have its fluctuations, but of course, driven by COVID and then the bullwhip effect and the impact on the supply chain, which is still continuing to this day, we've seen enormous fluctuations in the price of containerized shipping. And transport hasn't maybe had, road transport hasn't maybe had quite the ups and downs, but you can see from the index, it is nevertheless a volatile market. There are very obvious input costs, which everybody's aware of, such as fuel, and fuel, as we know, makes up a very high component part of a transport company's input costs, as well as labor. But just for businesses to understand and to be able to benchmark themselves, I think that's probably one of the easiest and the most intrinsically useful things that we can offer to the market. And I would say to businesses, look at the internal data. Yes, there are many sources of operational efficiency that you can see, as Kirsten says, from your TMS, from your telematics, and but also this market data. Marry that together. And also look at long-term trends. So, you know, what did January 2020 or 2021 look like? Because we all know that everybody who's been in transport for any length of time will be able to tell you what the seasonal highs and lows are, but how do they compare to previous years as a potential predictor for the future? I hope that answers that question.
Oh, excellent, fantastic. I think, you know, being able to leverage the data is key, right? I think that it can be easy to be almost sort of overwhelmed by the data that's available, but I think that the benchmarking point you raised, Lyall, is fascinating. I think that I've spoken to a number of organisations who are keen to sort of understand, you know, how am I doing? What's, you know, whether it's versus last year or versus the wider market or whatever it may be. But that benchmarking concept is really quite interesting, and I think you know, certainly some basic understanding of where I am and what I'm doing, but how I can understand what good looks like and where the opportunities are, and where I can really start to identify, you know, the next steps for sort of growth and opportunity, really. So just on the back of that point, we did promise that we would share a sneak peek on the January numbers, and what was fascinating is we did share a poll on LinkedIn to ask whether people thought it would go up, go down, or stay the same versus December. And you don't have to wait very much longer. So I'm delighted to share ahead of the general release, which will happen next week, the headline number for January. So if you've got your thoughts in your head about up, down, or the same. The final result is down. So no surprises for January, particularly if you've been around this game for a few years. But what is quite remarkable is really the start point that we find ourselves in January. So if we compare January 2022 to January 2021, we're some 15 points higher going into this year, which really is quite remarkable. So please do look out for the full release coming out next week via the usual channels. And if there's any more detail that you'd like to understand around the vehicle types or any kind of geographical areas, then please do reach out to us. We've got a huge amount more data behind the scenes. Of course, all aggregated and anonymized and completely safe, but you know, we're certainly keen to sort of understand how we can help those of us who are on the call in a little bit more detail. So moving on to now the Q&A section. So we've had a few questions in the chat. So let's just have a little look, shall we? I think we got a few in the Q&A. So let's just pull up here. We've got a couple on EVs. So that's obviously gone down well, which is fab. So we've got, let's start from the top, shall we? What data do you have on clean air zones and how can we access it? So let me answer that one. It's probably something I'm familiar with. We're able to map the booking data that we've talked about today to a regional level. Of course, we aggregate and anonymize that. And we've got sort of various processes in place to make sure that we never expose anybody's information. And when that's sufficiently done, we can then look at the impact of demand, as Kirsten mentioned earlier, on particular air zones and regions. We can also look at price. We can also look at the difference in the change in demand or supply. So do we have more vehicles, less vehicles going in or leaving empty? And as Kirsten said earlier, do we have more requests for capacity in that area, as I may not want to go my Euro 5 vehicle and pay that £100 charge or fine, or however it's called. One from the audience, James, what do you think is going to happen to driver pay going forward? So Kirsten, I think that's something that you and I touched on a couple of times in the lead up to the session today.
Well, we can see already online that agency rates are starting to decline a bit. For employed drivers, some of the extra that they received going into peak was in the terms of retention bonuses and things like that. So not part of ongoing wages. We're seeing various union negotiations going on. But what I would say is, like the TEG index, the job ads index on the Office for National Statistics site shows that vacancies are at a completely different level going into 2022. And believe it or not, we're not the sector that's experiencing the most shortage. So I think we're going to have to fight for staff, and that almost certainly has an implication for driver pay and other logistics roles.
Absolutely. Okay, thanks very much, Kirsten. let's go to the next question. This is a fantastic one on the back of electrified fleet. So I'll open this to both of the panel if you want to share your views. So what do we think will be the effect of a global transition to a more electrified fleet? And how the need for longer charging times compared to refueling at petrol stations, not to mention the comparative lack of availability, may affect the abilities to meet the same or higher levels of delivery requests, and indeed the relative price index impact. So that's quite a long question. Let's break that down. So we've got longer charging times, less of them available. Is it going to impact availability and price? What do we think, panel?
So the only thing with answering that question, Sam, is I think we've got to take a bit of a long-term view into the future of alternative fuels.
Sure.
Which is quite difficult, I think, at this stage, isn't it? And also, I think we need to break out the different types of transport and logistics and distribution between local or even hyper-local delivery, on demand, which we talked about earlier, versus routed deliveries, because they're very different aspects, aren't they, of local delivery. Middle mile, first mile. I mean, I read quite a bit of literature, as hopefully, I guess, as up to date as the commentators are able to, about alternative fuels and especially about electrification. But I don't think the answers are yet clear. Also, autonomous driving, which we haven't really talked about, and it's then that impact on the industry when there is rising demand. I mean, what's fascinating is, and we've been doing this Transport Exchange Group for 21 years now, is when we started, transport and logistics was far less understood and also far less central to the economy, or to many business operations, I should say, than it is today. Because I would argue now that supply chain and delivery has become, and logistics as a whole, has become central to a very significant amount of the economy, in a way that wasn't necessarily the case. Would you agree with that, Kirsten? 10 years ago, supply chain directors wouldn't necessarily be, represented on a main board of a larger corporate, and now it's, it's a big part of, it's a fundamental aspect of the operation of those businesses.
It's much more usual now, yes.
Yeah.
I mean, the picking up on the, the main thrust of this question, I saw an excellent presentation the other day by David Sabon to a CILT webinar, and I would really recommend it to anybody who's interested in the move to electrification and alternative fuels. I mean, David Sabon's view was that local stuff is all okay, and I think we can all see that the sorts of types of electric vans and electric mid-range trucks that are coming out now are going to deal with that market. The difficult area is trunking, and he definitely sees the future for trunking as being electrification of our motorways as opposed to batteries within trucks, and as opposed to hydrogen fuel cells. So I would recommend that webinar to anybody who's interested in that topic.
So to come back, if let's say that is the future, which sounds entirely plausible, and he's an expert, which you have to be immersed in literally where we are today in the technology and the rollout of those types of vehicles. I guess the question mark then is what happens in the interim period, and how does that affect price and availability? Because certainly, it's going to take a while, isn't it, to get to that future which you've just talked about, especially at the local level, simply because of the number of units that need replacing and the charging thereof.
Yes, and well, we all know the length of time that the smart motorways, which I don't particularly approve, have taken to implement electrifying the whole motorway network. It has to be an absolutely major job, and the idea that might be complete within, the next 15, 20 years is actually quite difficult to see.
Do we know what it's changing all the time, so forgive me if you haven't got the absolute up-to-date answer, but what is the relative cost per mile for an operator for an electric vehicle on let's say, local or short haul versus ICE? Do you have that?
I don't know.
No, okay. Fine.
All right,
let
me jump in and save you, Kirsten.
That was unfair for me to ask that, wasn't it, Kirsten?
We've got anything could happen, right? We've got 2 more questions. I'm mindful of time, but I'm going to ask you to be punchy on these, if that's okay, because we've got 2 more questions on the Q&A, and then we'll ask you for your kind of forward-looking views. So one from Paul in the audience. Thanks, Paul. Are there plans for CX and HX to extract or record Euro ratings for vehicles, EV payload details into carriers' fleet profiles, so that participants on TEG platforms can better attract the most appropriate carrier to a job that delivers into a clean air zone? I think that, Lyall, I don't know if you've got a view on that. I think we've certainly explored various options around. We can integrate with tracking partners that provide charge statuses of vehicles. And we've got some new things coming to the platform very soon around the entities on the platform and their capabilities, Lyall. So I don't know if you want to touch on that. Maybe I'll keep you to 60 seconds if that's okay.
Yes, I know that we've had businesses and operators asking to join the platform who have gone exclusively down the EV route. So they're new businesses which are taking a clean slate approach to that, and other businesses clearly will turn their fleet over as and when the availability, I guess, of the vehicles becomes apparent, because it's a vast task to go there. I believe you probably talk to this better than I can, Sam, that we've already geofenced the clean air zones, and the carriers are notified of a load if it either originates or is going to be delivered into a CAZ, so they can adjust their quote on that accordingly. But as I say, I think we'll get far more and more collaboration, and behaviour will change. But shippers' behaviour has to also change as well to recognise that.
Absolutely. So, Paul, thanks. Great question. I think let's look at that. Is a short answer.
Yeah, interesting enough. Sorry, if I can. Sorry, just I was thinking about this. So, if we go back actually to where we started in the year 2000 with Courier Exchange originally, the very, very first function that we built was, as you know, Sam, was the return journey feature. And we still have the same, or as it's been further developed, but we still have the algorithm which maps new loads which come into the freight exchange onto return journeys. And the concept being, which is still in use today, that we would make better utilization of empty running.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. But I think fantastic question. So, Paul, thank you. I'm going to we've got hopefully squeezing one more from Lynn in the audience. Thank you, Lynn. Do you think it will be cost or customer choice that will be the biggest driver for companies to upgrade to more environmentally friendly vehicles? So that's quite interesting. Amongst an inflationary market, is there any money left over to upgrade the trucks? What do we think, panel?
I'm going to ask Kirsten to answer that because she's far more
I think there's a real dichotomy between what people think they'd like to think and what they actually do. We see that in parcel deliveries and things like that. People, and we see it in terms of consumerism. People say that they'd like, they are environmentally friendly, they're environmentally conscious. And then when it comes to the decision to buy something, they buy it from somewhere where that it's being made by cheap labour, and it's being delivered by someone that's scarcely making a profit. And so I think it's, to a certain extent, it's up to the consumer to start being consistent in their decisions.
Yeah, I think that's a great shout, and I think it's about how, as the market's been so inflationary over the last 12, 18 months, I think how that has driven logistics up the process away from something that was very efficient and so very predictable towards something that's actually now a big part of people's entire businesses if they're affected by shortages or anything like this. So I think that there's going to be a lot more focus on it as we move forward, and I think that the shippers, as we call them, or indeed the end customers, retailers, manufacturers now are coming under increased pressure to do that. We see, the branded, very heavily branded vans around town, very clearly electrified. So I think that's going to be a continuing theme. So it'll be fascinating to see how that one plays out. So Lynn, thank you for your question there. So just as we wrap up our session together today, I just want to ask our two panelists for their thoughts as we wrap up and move into 2022. So Kirsten, as we look ahead to 2022, what are the key themes that you think those on the call should look out for?
Looking at 2022 and further ahead, I believe we'll be talking about another couple of I's, as well as inflation. And I was thinking about this before I saw today's news. We're going to be talking about interest rates a lot going forward, and also about investment. I think there'll be a real focus because of the inflationary factors that have affected the three key elements of haulage and couriers: the fuel, the driver, the vehicle. There'll be a real sort of pressure on indirect costs, overheads, head offices, looking to automate as many admin activities as possible. Thank you.
Excellent, Kirsten, thank you. And Lyall, your view for 2022?
Yes, 2022 and beyond. So I certainly agree with Kirsten that inflation is baked into the economy now, and there's obviously macro events taking place that are influencing some key input costs, especially fuel. I would add another two I's to Kirsten's, which are innovation and also integration. So innovation is always driven where two things are in place. First of all, participants, whether they're consumers or businesses, it's the same thing really, although they're different actors, have a need and a desire to accept innovation and to implement it. So talking about our industry, there's a tremendous amount of innovation which is both here now and also coming down the line, whether it's the stuff with EVs that we talked about, or autonomous driving, or some of the software and technology that powers the industry. There's a need to reduce costs and be more efficient. And thankfully, I can see that we're finally getting to a point where electronic paperwork, if I can call it that, is becoming more acceptable. So we'll finally manage to banish the physical paperwork out of the supply chain, which will be tremendous for everybody. And integrations is something which, first of all, it's innovative, but we really need systems linked up more fundamentally. And I think we've always promoted integrations on Transport Exchange Group. Those of you, well, people who have been on the platform for a long time will know that we were very early to integrate the telematics providers, for example, into the platform. But all of these systems really should be talking to one another seamlessly and in real time. So those are two fundamentals that I see growing in going forwards.
Excellent. Thank you, Lyall. And it leaves me to say thank you to our panelists, and thank you to you, our audience, for joining us today. It's been excellent to hear your thoughts, and thank you for your questions. If you've got any questions around the index, around what we've spoken about today, or there's some more detailed information you'd like to talk to us about, please do reach out to us via our normal channels. We'll be sharing some of this content via our usual socials as well. So thank you very much, and we'll see you all soon.
Thank you.